Hello cave dwellers, welcome into the cave, and don't worry, it's not an episode about an Epson printer, but it is all about what's in this box, a box which was kindly donated by cave dweller Mark. So Mark, thank you very much for sending it in. I hope inside to find an 8-bit micro by Atari. Yes, the first 8-bit Atari micro computer as opposed to console that we've touched on this channel to date. And that gives us a perfect opportunity to dive into the history of that range of micros and look specifically at what's in here. See if it's broken, fix it up if it is, and see it in action. A typical trash to treasure series then, as we've grown used to on this channel. But this one did come with a letter from Mark, and I won't spoil what's inside it before we do the unboxing, but he does say, I'm hoping that by donating this to the channel, you may be able to restore it back to its former glory and have another working exhibit for the cave. He says, I've checked the PSU and it appears to be outputting the correct voltages, but I've not tried powering on the computer itself, as I'm unsure whether or not there'll be some pre-flight checks that you want to carry out before doing so. Anyway, really enjoy the channel, especially the Trash to Treasure series, which this is, and I hope that this machine does not throw too many curveballs your way. Best regards, Mark. So thank you again, Mark. And I don't know about you, but I want to dive into this box and see what's in there. So let's see what we've got. Ooh, so what goodies do we have in here then? Now, I did open it as far as the first thing in the box to see what it was. The micro didn't arrive loose, in case you were worried. Everything was very well packed, as you'll see. The machine itself, it's fair to say, is showing its age. It certainly could use a good clean, but otherwise it's in good shape. Most notably, the brake key is missing from the keyboard, and this one was made in Taiwan, according to the sticker on the bottom. Atari switched manufacturing of this range from the US to Taiwan in 1983. We'll get to know it more intimately shortly, but let's see what else we've got here in the box. First up, we've got the manuals, and that's nice to have along with an RF cable and an SIO cable. Again, there'll be more on that later. We've got one manual for the system and one for Atari Basic, because no 8-bit worth its salt could be without a version of Basic, of course. And both are very small guides as they span 6 languages. But it's enough to get you started. You're programming by page 9 in the system guide, and in the basic guide you're making sounds within just a few pages using this musical scale. Nothing unusual there, but they are keen to promote its sound and video capabilities to get you hooked. And it really did hook you in as a kid when you got that first sound out of a machine or a pixel on the screen by your command, whatever micro it was you're doing it on. The next package is a heavy one, and inside is the power supply. And it, like the RF cable, has that lovely Atari logo on it. It feels so heavy that I'm guessing the insides are all potted in an epoxy resin, making maintenance nigh on impossible. And although Mark says he's tested it, we will double check that before plugging it in, just to be sure. Next up, we need to be able to load software, and it appears Mark used a cassette deck for the job. This XC12 tape deck is up to the task, but you'll notice it is a different colour to the machine itself. And there was an XL12 tape deck as well, which matched the 800XL style a little better, or the 1010 tape deck, which is a really nice match if you can find one. I particularly like the 1010. Side by side, you can see they are indeed a very different colour. And speaking of colour, the underside of the micro is closer to the original colour than the yellowed top side, so should we want to try and restore it, that's the colour we would be aiming for. Now what else have we got in this box then? Nothing, says 80s gaming, like a trackball. The first games that spring to mind for me when I see one are Missile Command and Marble Madness. Surely this thing will have a Missile Command clone, being an Atari classic. It doesn't twist open from the top. We need to unscrew it from underneath to get to that ball, and it sounds pretty rough. We'll definitely need to give that a service. And finally, lurking in the box, we have 2 game sausages. Let's tear into these. Sausage 1 reveals some unboxed tapes and some lovely clamshell boxes, including The Goonies on an Atari. Man, that's a nostalgic sentence to say out loud. Goonies on an Atari. And it's a great looking box. No instructions inside, just the tape, but I'm sure we can figure that out. We've also got Spy Hunter. I've got great memories of this game both in the arcades and on a ZX Spectrum, so it'll be interesting to see where this port sits on that scale between specky and arcade quality. And then Quasimodo by Synsoft looks to be a Hunchback clone. In the US, this developer was called Synapse Software. Synsoft was the brand under which US Gold repackaged them for the UK market. And my point of reference for Hunchback is not the arcade, but the Amstrad CPC version, so that will be an interesting comparison to make also. Game sausage number 2, please. Now these are familiar looking titles on budget labels like Mastertronic. I remember all of these being in the stores where I shopped for my Amstrad CPC. Chucky Egg there is another firm favourite. I'm looking forward to trying that out. And there's some ninja action going on here, as well as a tape with Rockford and Crystal Raider on the B-side of that tape, so it's a double game tape that. And they keep on coming, there's even more games. Now, I've read quite a few people commenting on just how slow it is to load tapes from the Atari 8-bits. We'll hopefully experience that for ourselves in the series, but at first glance the baud rate doesn't seem to be that much slower or faster than, say, other 8-bit micros like the C64 or ZX Spectrum, but that doesn't take into account any techniques for fast loading that were later developed to tackle those problems. So it's hard to say for certain. We'll just have to try it out and see how it compares. And maybe we'll try this Incredible Hulk drum hammering simulator. That one certainly looks interesting. All in all then, it's a really nice Atari spread on the table here to whet our appetites for today. Well, thank you very much, Mark, for sending this in. There's all sorts of goodies in that box. I'm particularly looking forward to seeing if the Spy Hunter conversion is any good. And also, what's the Goonies game all about? Is that any good? Goonies never say die, but to Atari 8-bit micros. I'm sorry, that's a terrible link, isn't it? But we're going to find out because I'm going to carry it over to the lab now. We'll prod and poke it. We'll see if it's working or if it needs any help to get it up and running before we hopefully clean it up and bring it back to its former glory as Mark has requested. And while I'm taking this over to the lab, let's get a quick history lesson. What is this micro? Why does it exist? What is the wider Atari 8-bit micro range at the time? And what was the climate of home computing when this was released? Let's find out a little bit more. The Atari 800XL is a member of Atari's 8-bit range of computers which ran from 1979 through to 1992. Quite the production run. But there were many models, tweaks and improvements to the machines throughout that period. The original family comprises of the Atari 400, of which I have a very sorry looking one here. That certainly needs more than just a plaster, and that will get some TLC soon. And the Atari 800, not the 800XL, complemented that 400 in the range. They were basically the same machine, with the $1,000 Atari 800 having composite video output in addition to the standard RF, expansion slots and a proper keyboard. Instead of the $500 Atari 400's membrane keyboard outfit, and the 800 had 48K of memory compared to the 400 16K. Incidentally, the 400 and 800 names were reflective of the 4 and 8K being the standard memory included, but the tumble in prices of RAM saw that increased in the final design. Atari pitched the 400 as a hybrid games machine with a keyboard, building on their arcade heritage and the success of the Atari 2600 console. And who can blame them for playing to their strengths? And the 800 would be pitched as the more serious computer for serious people, with expansion capabilities. Very serious stuff.
In fact, there's no end to your possibilities with Atari home computers. They're easy to use and afford. But best of all, they just might be the wisest investment you'll ever make.
Watch this. Hey, Mom! What's the capital of Delaware?
Dover.
I told you she's smart.
Atari home computers. We brought the computer age home.
They certainly look like a product of their time. Shades of 1970s beige and yellow decor can be seen in the styling, but looks can be deceiving. These were incredibly forward-looking designs, and we'll see why when I open mine up shortly. The 400 and the 800 were well reviewed on release, and the press were especially impressed with their graphical capabilities. And our 400 here has a story all of its own to tell when it has its own episode. But what we're interested in today is the 800XL, and that arrived later, in 1983 in fact. By 83, the home micro market was embroiled in a price war. Yes, you could still spend over $1,000 on a computer, but now the low-cost Commodore VIC-20 had become the first computer to shift 1 million units, a trend which continued in the Commodore 64, which raised our expectations of what we could get for our money in a home micro.
A revolution that can't be missed, but at $1,530 you could miss it. Atari says computers are now within reach. Well, the Commodore 64 has more built-in memory than the others, and it's under $600. So, while everyone else talks about the revolution that's coming, you can experience the revolution that's here.
This all happened under the watchful eye of Jack Tramiel at Commodore.
Well, my idea is always to try to bring the best technology at the lowest price to the masses. Mm-hmm. We are a company which we like to sell to the masses, not to the classes.
Okay.
Commodore had snapped up chip manufacturer MOS Technologies so that they could bake their own chips and take the fight to the competition. And boy did that fight rage, with the prices of micros tumbling in the early 80s. A little closer to home, here in the UK, the sub-£100 Sinclair ZX Spectrum set the baseline for what affordable computing looked like to us Brits. And in this context, our Atari 8-bits had lost their appeal. And this is where the 800XL steps in. Atari announced a new XL computer in December 82, the 1200XL. While the final design was less ambitious than originally planned, it had to be signed off and completed in order for Atari to keep up. The 1200XL came to retail in February 1983 with a sleek new design by Reagan Cheng of Atari's Industrial Design Group. 64K of RAM and a redesigned keyboard were included, but at $899 it left reviewers confused and consumers wanting. It soon became obvious that the 1200XL offered little more than the original Atari 800, less so if you'd already upgraded your 800 with additional RAM. And it broke compatibility with some existing software. The 800 had dropped massively in price by this stage. In some places you could buy it for as low as $165. So why then would you spend nearly $900 on this new 1200XL? Well, you can guess what happened next. Even with price cuts, the 1200XL didn't sell well, and anecdotally it's said that the sales of the old 800 actively increased as a result. The 1200XL was in production for just 6 months, but Atari had already thought ahead to its next release. In that same year of 83, Atari released the 600XL, which would replace the old 400. Just as the 400 is half of 800, the 600 was half of 1200, hence the choice of model number. But then our 800XL arrived, which not only replaced the original 800 model, it would put the misguided 1200XL to bed. The 800XL would sit as the top-of-the-line machine, despite plans for other machines such as the 1400XL, the 1450XLD, the 1060 and the 1600XL, that particular model set to be an Atari IBM PC hybrid box, all of which were cancelled in the prototype stage. So when you put aside all of that noise of unreleased prototypes, it's the 800XL that's sitting pretty and becomes the best-selling machine in the range. On our shores, we could pick one up for £249.99 or about $375, as you can see in this September 1983 price list. So we start to build a picture now of why the 800XL came into being and what it was dealing with at the time in 1983. But that only starts to tell a small part of the story. There's a lot more to be discovered inside the machine as we take a poke around and see if it actually works or if it needs any work on it to fix it. So what do you reckon? Should we go over to the lab? That's what I thought. Let's see what we're working with. First things first then, are we going to blow this thing up with a bad power supply? Well, let's get the multimeter onto it. We should have 3 pins with a positive 5V supply on them, pins 1, 4 and 6. And a careful poke around shows that we have all of those looking nice and stable. Any fluctuations you see on the meter are just my shaky hands causing contact to be broken. They are solid supplies. I should have trusted you, Mark, but it always bears checking twice. So happy to use that. We'll move on to the micro itself and perform a visual check inside, just in case of any leaks or visually obvious problems. So let's get all of those screws out. And on opening the case, if I take a peek, I can see that there is a 24-way keyboard ribbon cable on the right of your picture, so gently does it so as not to damage that. The cable just pops out of the connector, and then the top half is free from the bottom. But we're none the wiser as to what's actually in here because of the RF regulations of the day. They meant that this whole thing is encased in shielding, and the FCC, or Federal Communications Commission in the US, who enforced this, did not allow sizable holes in the shield that might allow for upgrades to slot in. Atari therefore designed the SIO, or Serial Input Output, computer bus, which we have here. And that's what the cable was for that we found in the box. It allows multiple devices to be daisy-chained, they're plug and play, and designer Joe DeCure attributes this to be the basis for modern-day USB. I told you this was quite a forward-thinking micro, and there's lots more to come. Now, speaking of designers like Joe, many of you will know that there is a name attached to the Atari 8-bit micros that's close to many of you as heart here on the channel, and that name is Jay Miner, aka the father of the Amiga computer. Jay had designed the TIA display chip in the Atari 2600 console in the 70s while he worked at Atari, and his follow-up chips, Antic, CTIA and GTIA, are the main chips alongside the CPU which power the Atari's 8-bit computers. That therefore makes this board, which we can finally see now that the shielding is removed, the spiritual grandfather of the Amiga computer itself. Amigas and Ataris living together, whatever next. The spec of our Atari 800XL here is as follows. We have 64K of memory, putting it on a par with the Commodore 64, a 6502B CPU, which ticks along at just under 1.8 MHz, and that CPU is nicknamed Sally by Atari. Atari Basic and the OS sit in 2 ROMs here, and there's also Microsoft Basic available for the machine as a cartridge or on a floppy if you so desire that flavour. And then we have those custom chips that really give this machine its character. A good place to start is with Antic, or Alphanumeric Television Interface Controller. This generates the playfield graphics, text and bitmaps. The next chip, GTIA, or Graphics Television Interface Adapter, adds colour to those playfields created by Antic and overlays the sprites, the players and the enemy sprites for example. So this micro has hardware sprite handling. This GTIA chip superseded the older CTIA or Color Television Interface Adapter found in earlier systems, so you may well have one of those older chips if you have an earlier Atari 8-bit. Great graphics deserve great sound, and Atari attempted this with the next chip, which is named Pokey, a name derived from the words potentiometer and keyboard. Its job is to scan keyboard input as well as to perform analog to digital conversion on input from controllers with potentiometers. A paddle controller, for example, for a game of Pong. But amongst this chip's numerous capabilities, it also offers 4 channels of sound. And it has arcade credentials. Pokey can be found in cabinets such as Missile Command and Gauntlet. No, not this Gauntlet. The real Gauntlet cabinet. Put your toys away now. And to control those glorious games recreated using this array of chips, we need to use a joystick. And our Atari 800XL offers 2 joystick ports. That's down from the 4 ports on others in the range, like the original 400. You can see all 4 ports lining the front of the 400 there. And these are managed by the PIA, or Peripheral Interface Adapter here. That's a Motorola MCS 6520 chip. So I hope you feel a bit more familiar with the system now, what it's made up of, and very nicely it is laid out too. But the big question we're all asking is, does it work? And here's what happened when I tested it for the first time. And I could see no reason as to why we shouldn't. There's no bulging or leaky caps or anything like that. So I went ahead and plugged it in and fired it up. And my first attempt was met with a black screen. I'm connecting to the TV with the composite cable, and I know that that cable's fine. Now, some old micros can get a bit funny about being fired up with no keyboard plugged in, so I went ahead and plugged that back in and came back around the desk to turn it on. But we had exactly the same problem, a black screen. But this time, did you notice a flash of colour there when we turned it on? If not, don't worry, here it is again in super slow motion. You're on the edge of your seats, I can tell. That flash of colour suggests to me that the CPU, Sally, is actually doing something, so that's a good sign. It doesn't seem to be completely dead. Next up, I decided to perform a sound test. Is the machine working? It's just that there's no video output. To do this, the service manual says you press and hold down the Option key on the keyboard while turning the machine on, press Select once, and then Start. And then you should hear some tones. But when I tried this, I got absolutely nothing at all. And just in case it was something to do with the composite output, I did switch over to RF, and all I could see was the black screen again while I tried to tune it in, so it's nothing to do with that. Now, the service manual suggests a black screen is a symptom of a bad clock circuit, but I wanted to stick to a few more basics first so as not to overlook anything obvious. First up, I left it powered on for 10 minutes while checking if any of our chips got unusually hot. And poking around, nothing really got too hot. The CPU warmed up a little bit, but that's about it. Nothing else really heated up. So the next step I took, as we've got 4 of our chips socketed here, was just to take a moment to remove them, clean the sockets, clean the legs of the ICs. I was using contact cleaner and an anti-static brush to give them a scrub, and ensuring that everything is dry and then reseated, so there can be no doubt that those chips aren't in properly. Sometimes they get hot and pop out a little bit and you don't quite notice it, so it was worth a try. And you know what? When I was doing this, I noticed that the CPU had a slightly white crust on its legs. Not a huge amount, just a little bit, to raise some concerns. So I gave that a good scrub, popped it back in, and guess what? When I turned it on, it flicked into life. Brilliant. But after a couple of hours, when I returned to the machine to test it again, we had exactly the same problem. So this time, I rubbed Sally's legs down with some fine grit sandpaper. Ooh. And 72 hours later, I left it for a weekend and came back and checked it again. It worked perfectly, so I think we can safely say that Sally's legs were the problem. And here's what happens when we power it on. Has a little think about it, and then it goes to a ready prompt on the screen. But we will just run that diagnostic test to see what it looks like. So I need to hold down the Option key as I power it on, keep it held down. Hold it down, just keep it held down. And then we've got our self-test. So we've got a choice of memory, audio-visual, keyboard, or all tests. Well, we might as well go for all tests. Let's see. I haven't done this yet, so let's see what it throws up. Where's my down key? Very difficult working upside down. Or maybe I have to press select. There we go. Select and start. Just checking the ROM. Checking the RAM. Oh, this is really useful to have built into the machine. It's working its way through those 8 RAM chips. Green dots so far. Let's hope it stays that way. Aha! Well, our RAM's good and Pokey sounds good. Okay, and it's just looping around. I'm not sure what the keyboard test was telling us, but I can certainly perform a keyboard test myself. Amazingly, every single key is working. So no problems with keys, apart from our missing break key. No problem with keyboard membranes or anything like that at this point. Wow, that is a brilliant result. I think you'll agree. It doesn't like having the keyboard left on its head, unsurprisingly. There is one more thing I wanted to test, and I have actually got a game cartridge here. It's Miner 2049er. Let's plug that in. Now, there's only one cartridge slot on this. On the earlier models, there was a left and a right cartridge slot. So you would put a cartridge in, and then a second cartridge was able to expand upon whatever program you were running, but they cut it down to 1 for this. So let's turn it on with the cartridge in. Oh, it's gone on to the self-test. What is that then? Ah. Oh, pokey's definitely working. Oh, that doesn't look great, does it? That doesn't look good at all. I wonder if the pins on this are dirty. They don't look great. So again, the basics. Let's get some IPA onto this cartridge and give it a scrub. Right, is that happier now? Let's turn it on. He seems good. Let me get a joystick and we'll put those ports to the test. It's all working great. This is fantastic. Oh, I wasn't supposed to go off at the end there. Joystick works great. The cartridge slot now works great. The story of this machine then is filth. Filth and dirt. Dirt on the CPU, dirt in the cartridge slot and probably on the cartridge as well. And I can see plenty more dirt on the board. So I think before episode 2, I'm just going to pull all those chips out again, give it another good scrub, sandpaper those legs just very gently. It's a very, very light grit sandpaper. What was I using? A 1200 grit. So really, really fine sandpaper on those legs. I will clean up the board with the IPA and a brush, and then we should be good to go. We can get to work in our next episode on the aesthetics. And I've got a question for you guys about that. And we've got that lovely letter from Mark explaining how this was his machine and what he did with it growing up. Now the question is, do we try and do a full restoration where we retrobrite this machine and find a replacement brake key and try to make it look as new as possible? Or do we take that letter, do we frame it and turn this into kind of a museum piece where you can set it up with the letter, where we obviously give it a good clean on the outside, it needs that, and maybe we don't replace the brake key. Maybe we 3D print a key that is obviously, it's functional, but obviously a replacement, so you can see its scars. And you just set it up with the letter, almost like a letter of authenticity next to it, and it wears its scars with pride. It's patina, as our good friend Keith over at the channel, The Digital Orphanage, would say. So, I want to hear your opinions in the comments. Do you want looking like new, or do you want that kind of museum piece set up? Let me know, and in episode 2 we will continue our history lesson, and I'll get to work on cleaning it up in whichever way we decide. Until then, a little bit more manic mine. It's not manic miner, it's miner 2049er. A bit more of that. See you next time. Thank you very much for watching and take care.